Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. I hope everybody's having a beautiful day. I hope the sun is shining. I hope the birds are singing. I hope the wind is at your back. And I hope that you are ready for a brilliant show this mid morning or afternoon or whenever you're watching or listening to this. I want to welcome everyone to the discussion today with a brilliant mind at the forefront of neuroscience and mental health innovation, Dr. Amy Reichelt. With over 15 years of experience spanning the pharmaceutical industry and academia, Dr. Reichelt has cemented herself as a leader in the exploration of groundbreaking therapies for some of the most pressing psychiatric and neurological challenges of our time. From depression and anxiety to traumatic brain injuries and neuropathic pain, Dr. Amy's subject matter expertise is as vast as it is impactful. She has successfully led cross-functional teams through preclinical and clinical research programs, contributed to multiple patent inventions, and played an instrumental role in securing $3.6 million in non-dilutive research funding. With her deep understanding of regulatory standards, she has driven the successful development of IND filings and early-stage clinical trials, bridging the gap between innovative discovery and patient care. She is not only a scientific powerhouse with over 50 peer-reviewed publications in top-tier journals, but also a sought-after speaker on the global stage. From psychedelic science to TED Sydney, her presentations captivate audiences, blending cutting-edge science with practical insights into brain health, mental wellness, and the transformative role of diet and exercise. Passionate, visionary, and endlessly curious, she embodies a commitment to advancing mental and physical well-being as a cornerstone of health. Whether she's conducting translational research, fostering collaboration across industries, or sharing actionable brain health strategies, her impact is both profound and far-reaching. Dr. Amy, I'm so stoked you're here today. How are you?
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. I'm like, oh my God, was that me?
Yeah, it's like looking into a mirror and realizing, hey, this person's pretty amazing. I'm stoked you're here, man. Thanks for doing all the things you've been doing recently. How's it going over there?
It's going well. We're in Toronto. It's hitting up winter. So,
Mhm.
suddenly it's less like green and fresh. It's more sort of, settling into the grey sludge of of winter, which anyone who lives in Toronto will understand. But yeah, everything's going good. So happy to be here today.
Yeah, we recently met on psilocybin in San Francisco, where we were working on a panel together and just diving into some fascinating topics about, drug development, psychedelics, and the movement that psychedelics is sort of having, maybe the moment psychedelics is having right now. And I just kind of wanted to maybe begin the process by what was your foray into psychedelics? Have you always been fascinated by them? Was it just sort of the way in which the mind works, or what really kind of brought you into the world of psychedelics?
Well, we can go all the way back. When I was at university as an undergrad, I was really interested in pharmacology and
Mhm.
psychopharmacology in particular. So I just thought it was really amazing that you could be a scientist and you could literally just study drugs. I was like, sign me up. That
Right?
sounds like the kind of thing that I want to know. And I was also really interested in how, the brain works as well, and the impact of how drugs change our behavior and also how they alter our neurochemistry. So my first foray really into scientific research was as, sort of a naive undergraduate, donning my lab coat for the first time. And I got to give rats the munchies by literally administering them THC. And I was like, this is amazing. And like, nobody really, it wasn't like groundbreaking science in any way, shape, or form. We were using an a drug analog called rimonabant, which is a CB1 inverse agonist. So basically, it blocks off the CB1 receptors, and it was being used for a weight loss drug at the time. And it
Mm.
kind of just took all the joy out of eating. So it wasn't actually, it actually got approved and then was withdrawn in terms of the approval. But I was messing around with like the endocannabinoid system, looking at how it changes palatability, and I was like, do you know what? this is my calling. I'm just going to give rats drugs. And that moved into then going to do my finishing up my undergrad, then going into a PhD. My PhD was sponsored by Eli Lilly, so yay, serotonergics. But I was actually working in the neurodegenerative drug hunting team at the time that all of neuroscience was kind of being shut down in the UK because nobody'd really achieved anything much. And I was doing that, and my PhD was around neurodegeneration, how different sorts of neurodegenerative disorders impact cognition, and starting to really understand how different drugs can stimulate cognition. So went in from there, looking at memory, and then never really got to psychedelics until when I was finishing up well, it was kind of during COVID, actually. So I'd always really been interested in psychedelics, but I'd never really worked on serotonin systems. I was really interested in dopamine and reward learning, addiction, and that side of things, particularly around how food influences cognition, how that is changed in terms of neuroinflammation happening in the brain, and how that was influencing memory formation, potentially food addiction. But then COVID happened, and I was like, this is a global mental health crisis, just setting up more so than it was already. And I got so interested in how psychedelics were, a potential game changer to really shake up the mental health care in worldwide, because it was so limited. What are the options for people with depression and anxiety? SSRIs, and then some CBT if you're lucky to have that on your insurance plan. And I was like, there's got to be more than this. And looking at all the interesting work that had come out of like John Crystal's lab with ketamine, and how it was increasing neuroplasticity, and how ketamine was now being utilized as a rapid-acting antidepressant, and changing people's lives, helping people who are having mental health crises. I was like, this is actually the shakeup that I think psychiatry and really, really needed.
I love it. It's a beautiful answer. I'm stoked to get to learn more about the way in which you're here and you're acting out it. What about you? It seems to me that you also have a fascination with behavior. Is that something that was fostered at a young age, or were you always the person like, why are they doing that? I wonder what that is. Like, what is your relationship to the fascination of behavior?
I always found it really interesting from that biological, like why we do certain things, and how we're influenced not only by our environment, but how we've learned, and what shapes our both personalities, but also how that then influences how we interact with a really dynamic environment, and how we can change behaviors, and conversely how we become rooted into certain maladaptive behaviors that have sort of become like our thought patterns and our habits that we start to develop. And I think that extends to like then how the brain is controlling that. And I was really fascinated during my PhD, in particular in the prefrontal cortex, which is our bit of the brain that's considered to be our executive function, our brain CEO, so to speak. And this is the area of the brain that's so closely involved in decision making, controlling impulses, and is also the brain area that starts to become compromised in certain disorders like frontotemporal dementia, and drug addiction and depression even as well. It's almost like our brain is becoming shut down, and that means that we end up in a cycle where we can't change behaviors as easily, because this area is becoming compromised. But what's really cool is that there's now, therapies that are starting to recognize that this area of the brain is so critical. When we look at things like TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation, that's applied usually across like the prefrontal cortex areas, and that's enhancing plasticity and then helping people who've got treatment-resistant depression start to overcome some of those ruminations, these very embedded thought patterns, and helping people as well that getting their decision making back online. It's the tough part, really. But once you start gearing up the brain once again, that's going to help people make those actionable life changes that then help them in the future and alter their behaviors.
Thank you for that. It's such an interesting equation to think about the way in which behaviors and mechanism of action and agonist and all these things work. Like sometimes I go down these rabbit holes and then I start reading into these things and I start wondering, like, are we ever truly going to understand mechanism of action? Like, it just seems so complex. Like there's so many variables. And it's like, can we even measure all these variables? I know that's kind of a broad question, but do you think that we're getting closer to thoroughly understanding mechanism of action in some of these experiments and clinical trials?
I think that we're just really scratching the surface in so many ways.
Right.
I think that there's the preclinical science that people are doing with rodents. I mean, there's some amazing research coming out, and I'm always reading these awesome papers, and they're looking at like prefrontal cortex spine density of neurons being measured in a mouse brain, and these little mice are getting given like psilocybin, like cool stuff coming up like Alex Kwan's lab, where that he's actually measuring these over time and looking at dynamic spine changes. I'm like, that's wicked. But then I'm also like, there's this whole like old school of thought that's like mice don't even have prefrontal cortexes. They've just got sort of an analog. It's just not as highly developed as the human brain. So in a way, we're looking at it through a really reductionist lens to be able to say, well, this neuron is changing a bit, but what then impact does that have on higher cognitive functions of humans who are experiencing such a more complex architectural environment that they are experiencing with all these different emotions and feelings and memories. So there's going from that sort of microscopic and then also going to brain imaging, where we're really starting to understand the functional implications of how behavior is changing, all the dynamics that are happening in the brain. It all depends on how it's being measured. I mean, like you can get these incredibly high powered like MRIs now, so magnetic resonance imaging, and they're like, look at this, it's like 12 Tesla, and you're like, cool, that's going to give you a really, really detailed static view of like a picture of somebody's brain. But still then the functionality, if you're looking at functional MRI, it's still like, it's actually associating blood flow changes. So you're not even looking at neurons, and you're just looking and sort of being like, oh, a hemodynamic response change. So it's not measuring in the same way. And then you've got these other techs like MEG, which is like EEG, but kind of, souped up a bit, and measure all these different brain oscillations. And everything is just changing all the time. Like you're learning new pipelines, there's new engineering patterns, and there's new types of sensors that you're using to measure. And you've got all this happening in, the academic sphere. But then you've also got, clinical trials where when it comes down to the clinical trials, although you want to run an innovative clinical trial, it can't be that innovative because you need everything to be really rooted into, FDA standards. So, when I'm advising on clinical trials, I'm like, let's not go too far here. The paper that came out last week that I almost like cheered for, because it was saying that human plasma BDNF, which we all love BDNF because it's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's like miracle grow for our neurons. But the way of measuring it, I mean, it's cool to do it in the brain of rats and mice because you can literally, look at the brain, check it out, like mush it up, measure things. You can't do that with humans. So they're doing peripheral measures, which is blood BDNF. So what's coming out from our periphery. And then, and now they're having the realization that, that's not a very good measure because it turns out BDNF circadian. It gets made not just in the brain. Apparently, some of it comes from the liver, and it's one of those things where we have all these great ways of measuring things in an animal preclinical, non-clinical model, but then when you get to the actual human clinical side, the translation is just completely lost or flimsy at best.
It's such a great answer. Thank you for that. It just runs the gamut of human emotions. Like, it's so exciting in so many ways. And to read some of these papers, it is mind-blowing to be like, oh my gosh, what could this mean? Well, it could mean all of these things. And on one hand, it's so exciting, but on the other hand, you're like, what about this person that's bipolar or this person that has this particular disease? Like, we can't even test it in them because there's too much liability there. You know what I mean? It's like we have all this promise, but too much liability. It's such a fascinating time to be alive.
I mean, it's totally, when you think about the exclusion criteria for these clinical trials, because again, like, you don't want, I mean, this is just across the board in clinical trials in general. You don't want to be able, you don't want your drug to fail. So you want to restrict during the clinical trial to make it as clean as possible in terms of, variables that could potentially influence the outcomes. I mean, I think about things like not just psychedelics, but also when we think about things like the GLP-1 agonists that are being used for obesity treatment. So many of the studies that were done on Ozempic excluded people with depression. And that actually cuts down a large number of people because we know from research, and I mean, the research that I was doing with nutrition, that if you're eating a diet that's got a lot of, these ultra processed junk foods in, it actually makes you depressed, at least if you're a rat. But there's direct implications as well that individuals who have poor diets do have poorer mental health, and then you're excluding them from effectively taking a drug that could not only have knock-on effects of the weight release and loss of body fat, but also then they're like, oh, psychiatric effects. These people seem to be feeling better in themselves, and now there's all this interest as well about substance use disorders as well, and trying to look at in that effect. And I'm like, come on guys, this is like there are food addiction traits in many people who are overweight. You're like recalibrating the body and the brain to an extent that maybe when people start feeling better, they don't want to comfort eat as much, and then their diet improves, and then they start feeling even more better. It's like a nice vicious cycle that's going to help people.
Yeah, I think that's well said. The idea of patterns and getting stuck in patterns, whether it's the inner dialogue or it's the eating habits, or there's so much to be said about it. I want to stop for a moment and recognize our friend Thomas Hutchison. He's coming in from Facebook, and he says, I find it really interesting how randomly SSRIs and SNRIs affect neurodivergence, and how things like THC, CBD, and codeine, when responsibly used, can almost balance the body's chemistry, especially for those with automatic nervous system dysfunction. And in some cases, like in paroxysmal arterial fibrillation, SSRIs and beta blockers can worsen and lengthen symptoms. Could you touch on the nervous system reset function that some hallucinogenics are said to have, like Iboga?
Okay, so that's quite a big question, and there's a lot going on there.
Nice.
So, I mean, to think about it, when people are experiencing depression and anxiety, and also, that is also, manifesting these psychiatric symptoms, mood disorders associated with individuals with neurodivergence as well, because, it's stressful if people are having to, undertake masking behaviors, leave people fatigued, and, they're, trying to, control your day-to-day life can leave you at this sort of heightened state where, when we think about the autonomic nervous system, there's two sides of it. So we've got our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight, and then we've got our parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest. And these two sort of work in sort of harmony, but for many people, particularly those who've experienced trauma or stress, anxiety, chronic stress, you've got a lot of sympathetic activity. And I think that, there's this recalibration that can happen with people where, with psychedelics as well, it's, the surge of neuroplasticity associated with it, it's starting to understand your feelings a lot more, and that sort of oneness that you start to feel from, the classic psychedelics, like, I'm speaking from more of a psilocybin than iboga. I've studied ibogaine, but, from more of a clinical standpoint, understanding around psilocybin, that, it is helping individuals, put that, behaviors more into perspective, sort of a general feeling more of well-being. There's also been, studies where they're starting to, understand from, say, like Michael Bogenschultz's work, that, substance abuse disorders, alcohol use disorder is, greatly reduced following, these treatments with psilocybin, and knowing that these kind of behaviors as well are usually coping behaviors to deal with, the stresses of daily life. And in a way as well, they are part of that cycle that tends to make things worse. But then if you're starting to remove those elements from your behavior, from your daily life, that then they're having an additional knock-on effect of, helping to restore that, sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system balance, and getting your autonomic nervous system realigned. I can't speak much to like beta blockers, really. I mean, I have taken them in the past. It's like, for me, they're great for, taking that autonomic edge where it's more like the effects, where you've got the, the sweaty palms, like sometimes you get the shakes, and, they annihilate that. They also annihilate my ability to like walk upstairs because my heart can't get up. But it's, that they're obviously effective in terms of the physiological symptoms of stress, and removing, like the heart, palpitations that people experience, high blood pressure. But, speaking from, my knowledge around there, that they don't have as much of an effect on the psychological component that is such a play when it comes to these kind of, experiences and conditions that people have.
Great answer. I don't know that I've ever heard the term reset and neuroplasticity together, but it makes such perfect sense to start thinking about. And maybe people should be talking more about that and linking the two together. Like, what in the midst of a psychedelic journey and a difficult part of the trip, what you're experiencing is neuroplasticity in real time. Maybe that's why it's so difficult, because all of a sudden your brain's like, okay, let's try and process information over here. Let's try it over here. And it would also explain why you're able to see things in a third person point of view, or at least in a different point of view on some level. Like, it makes me excited to see those two things coming together. And I know it might not be super scientific to say that's how you feel neuroplasticity, but I think it helps, right? If we can start talking in terms that people understand, we're starting to bridge that gap of inevitability, or whatever that word is called.
Yeah, I could never like pronounce it. I'm like, it's just called like oceanic boundlessness instead. I'm like, the other ones are just, they're a lot. But it does make sense that, it's like during the trip where people are like, oh my God, I'm like, visual distortions, but
Right.
things also start to, when people say like, oh, the sound is intensified, like how they're really
Yep.
experiencing these new aspects of behaviors and like cognitions and putting things together in like a new light. I mean, I used to work a lot on the process called memory reconsolidation, which is it's kind of fallen from favor in terms of the neurobiology of it, and it was really cool in sort of, well, it's like in the sort of 10 15 years ago, people were like, oh, memory consolidation, it's going to like solve everything. But thinking about it from more of a therapeutic point of view as well, it's like it's that destabilization of a memory that drives a behavior. And when you reconsolidate it, so by destabilizing it, you can then add information to it. And I think this is a lot of how psychedelics are working. And this is my one of my many soapboxes that I like to get on. But it's that process where you could add in information to what is essentially a very core, poignant, often painful memory of a trauma that is then driving a lot of behaviors, and being able to update that with the new information that you are aware of, but it just doesn't seem to stick. And for people, I think with conditions like PTSD or complex PTSD and have had traumatic experiences, that being able to update those very pertinent core memories that could be potentially driving number of their symptoms, which are then becoming stronger and stronger through that association, being able to start to break that association is really at its crux of then being able to update it and take some of that emotional component away, so people can be like, oh yeah, that happened, but I'm not having flashbacks about it anymore. I'm not having those hugely negative reactions that are making it such a important aspect of my life that's having a negative impact. Instead, it's making it so it's just part of you, that you're like, it's okay, that happened. It's like having a scar and you're like,
Mm-hmm.
story about that scar, this is what happened, but not having the emotional component to it. And I think that's something that psychedelics are going in terms of the therapeutic aspect of them. I think it's such a core component of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's that integration process. And, sometimes we look back at some of the most traumatic events in our lives, or even some generational trauma that you can look at that was never dealt with. And was just, here, you hold on to this now. Okay. I can't fix it. I'll give it to my kid to hold on to, and it just stays in there. And you're like, I don't even know why I feel like this, but I hate it. And when you could sneak up on there and look at it without shame or guilt and just hold it for a little while, it's like, okay, I can stare into this thing. And you know what? It's a
Yeah.
scar, but it's got a cool story behind it. Maybe there's something I can do with this thing. It's
Yeah.
interesting to think about it from that aspect.
Yeah, and I also think about, with like processing like somatic experiencing. I think that, one of the aspects of psychedelics is that almost it changes the modality of traumas. It's almost like it's shutting off your brain and being like, oh, hey, so now let's just listen to like your knees or,
Mm,
your womb or something. It's that body part that you almost, this is like, psychologically, that you shut down and you don't listen to certain pain that you've experienced. And when I think about with somatic things, that cortisol is so it's produced by your adrenal glands that are just above your kidneys, and it's flooding into your pelvis at all times because that's where it's produced, so that's going to be where it is kind of concentrated as well. And then, when you're doing somatic exercises, that people tend to feel like, oh my God, like, I feel like a release in my back. I feel a release across my abdomen. And it's those physical feelings that, through somatic experiencing, you don't even have to bring up the trauma. It's just, those physical sensations that are being, reintegrated and understood, and almost like there's, that with, Peter Levine's work on somatic experiences, that you're completing that trauma cycle that we never get to complete when we experience stressful experience. We have a stressful experience. We just, swallow it down and just be like, oh God, I'll think about that in, several nights time, and it'll wake me up, and I'll just, swallow it back down again. But it's that completion of the experience that our body needs to process. And I think that psychedelics, for people with very complex traumas, they're helping people release and really close that circle of trauma to, be like, okay, I've dealt with it now, and my body has dealt with it. And that the link between the mind and body, I think, has been so overlooked. And I think that psychedelics is something that's really shaking up that area as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's really well said. I'm reminded of the book "The Body Keeps the Score," like the four agreements, and how our language and our state is closely tied to our behavior and the way we see ourselves and our body on some level. There's some really deep ties that that have gotten away from us. Like maybe our body is a direct reflection of how we feel about ourselves or how we see ourselves on some level, or the patterns of our thought on some level. We don't really talk about that too much.
Yeah, agreed. I think that we, just as a culture,
Yep.
there is a lot of us just, swallowing things down and just being like, this is something that, I'm just going to try and ignore and just get on with things. And we have so many wounds that we take
Yep.
forward in our lives, and we don't let them heal. And I think that that's when, the manifestation of mental health conditions start to arise. And again, it is so important that, we start to acknowledge that, just, treatments with, say, an SSRI or an SNRI, they do increase neuroplasticity to an extent, but it's not in the same way that, it's been shown with these like rapid acting antidepressants like ketamine, but also with psilocybin, and starting to understand more about how these compounds are actually affecting the brain. The effects are so profound and so quick. And that's when people need it. It's not like, oh, you feel like crap, like you're having a mental health crisis, take these pills. They've got they've got a black box warning on them for a reason, that they can make you feel even worse. And they've got, horrific side effects associated with them, emotional numbing, like loss of libido, like, just generally feeling completely gray and like a zombie. And they're like, well, just deal with that it might kick in about 3-4 weeks. We'll just, people need treatment now, and, they need treatment that lasts.
Yeah, sometimes I got a copy of the DSM, and sometimes I'll just read that and be like, man, what is this? This is a bunch of people getting together and just on some level allowing for the sickness of society to continue to happen. Like it seems like so much of the illnesses that we have are inflicted by the culture. Like when you see people that are ill, maybe it's something that they have that's a generational, or it's environment, or it's something that's in their genetics. But I can't help but think it's partly the culture, And I think of this great book by Guy Debord called The Spectacle of Society, and he talks about that. It's in a world that is, how does the quote go? I'm butchering it a little bit, but it's something along the lines, in a culture that is sick, the most well-adjusted might be the sickest. And like look at so many people around us that are struggling right now, and you can see it in their bodies, you can see it in their relationships with themselves and their family, and divorce rates, and children committing suicide, and veterans committing, like I don't think that's a personal decision by any means. That's our culture. These are symptoms of a sick culture on some level. Is that too much, or what do you think about that?
No, I genuinely agree. I think that, it's one of those aspects where people are just, like, mental health is stigmatized.
Yes.
And it prevents people who need help getting help because of the stigma associated with going through something that's affecting your mental health on multiple levels. And it's just so difficult for individuals as well to be recognized that that is happening to them. That I think about someone's broken their arm, and you could be like, okay, they've broken their arm, like they've got to take some time off work maybe because they can't type, or we'll give them some time to have an operation for this. But then the mental health aspect of things is just completely overlooked. It's like there's stigma associated with even admitting that you're having struggles with a situation. And I almost feel like there's this westernized viewpoint where you go to your family doctor, a GP, and like the first thing they say is like, oh, okay, so you're having a rough time. How long has it been? And you're like, oh, this number of weeks, months, or whatever. And they're like, okay, so I'll write you a prescription for an antidepressant. It'll be, usually escitalopram or, fluoxetine or whatever. And they're like, just take the low dose to start with and then build it up. And then, just tell me how it's going in like a couple of months. There's no real like continuity of care. There's no, like, do you want to go? Why are you in that situation?
Right.
Like sometimes they'll acknowledge, be like, oh, so this sounds like it's situational because you're
Right.
having time with your job, or you're having some family issues. But again, it's not treating the root cause. It's basically just putting a band-aid, just being like, there you go, be a functional human being again. Like, get to work, sit at your desk, don't make a fuss, don't be too like vocal about things, and just get on with it. And I think that it's a crying shame, to be honest, that that's the way that our culture really works on these things.
Yeah, it kind of scares me about psychedelics right now too, because while there is so much promise in there, it seems to me we've spoken a little bit about SSRIs, the culture, and the way in which we utilize symptom management. But I'm beginning to see on the forefront, like I talk to a lot of cool veterans groups, but it kind of seems to me like there's this commodification of veterans on some levels. And I'm happy that a lot of them are finding ways in order to come upon PTSD and solve it. But isn't like the real reason these veterans are having PTSD is because of like the war movement? Like, it's great to solve these problems, but at the same time, like, hey, maybe we should have more of a robust movement like in the 60s where we're like, this whole war thing has to stop. Like, look at the people coming back. Like, that's the root cause of it. I'm glad that people can face those problems, but and then you start looking at like, wow, this veteran group probably gets a grant from the industrial complex. They're probably, hey, just shut up about that part, but figure out this part. Like, isn't this good enough? It just seems like on some level, psychedelics is being held in this medical container that is still symptom management. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, when it comes down to veterans, I mean, I think that one of the aspects is that when veterans when you leave your service of the army, effectively in the army, you've been conditioned behaviorally to respond in a specific way. And you have this hypervigilance because you're in combat zones and under threat. It's an incredibly, and we're just talking about the autonomic nervous system, like these are people who are in sympathetic because they're like fight or flight, literally. And they've got their teammates around them as well, squads, and they're seeing things that are incredibly challenging psychologically, and they don't have appropriate psychologists there to be able to unpack that. And then when they've come to the end of their service, they're retired and they're just released into society, which they're not prepared for. And this is what I find when I've spoken with veterans, is this that this heightened threat that they've been conditioned to always be hyper alert and hyper vigilant. Okay, so yeah, that's really helpful when you've been, in Afghanistan or, on that situation. But you're now in downtown San Francisco, or you're just in London or Toronto. Like, you don't need to be in that hypervigilant state all the time. And this is why as well, then they're having this adjustment issue, coming back to a world that they've been not part of in a way. And I see that is potentially really stemming a lot, when we look at veterans, and they do have not only like high rates of PTSD, alcohol use disorders, and then also people who've been exposed repeatedly to blast injury, like just from gunfire, and the brain injury that can be set up in place by being exposed to like shock waves from gunfire. So many rounds of gunfire, it's like right close to your head.
Yeah.
Your brain's going to get shaken up a bit. And that we then know that there's that ongoing impact that traumatic brain injuries are hugely prevalent in the military and have a huge impact, not just through if you've had a concussion, but subconcussive impacts as well, that it's affecting your brain's function, how it's connecting together, and how you're able to form new behaviors and integrate again into a society that you've not been part of for a period of time. And that's then an adjustment that people are making as well. And then the mental health downstream, that the struggles that people are experiencing, it's like, it's not surprising that these individuals are in these situations. And I think that there's a lot of push in military veteran groups for the access to psychedelics, as there was with cannabis as well. And I think again that it may be very beneficial for these individuals. I don't think it's a panacea, it's going to solve everything, but it might be one of those things where people are able to find some closure and that reset again, that they need to be able to help them function without these ongoing stresses in life that is affecting their mental health.
Yeah, it's such a pertinent time to be looking at these situations and wondering how we can change it, and just doing a deep dive on what the good, the bad, and the ugly is. We got another question coming in from our friend Clint, and he says, "Can you share a personal or professional moment where the potential of psychedelic therapy to heal emotional wounds was most vividly illustrated to you?"
I think that it's really been, I like to listen to a lot of people's anecdotes. I mean, that's could be something that I've found has been, really rewarding for me, and understanding. And I think there's some clinicians who are doing such amazing work out there. One of the clinicians that I've spoken with in the past, Peter Hendricks at University Alabama Birmingham. He does a lot of work with individuals who have substance abuse disorder. And I remember him telling me that that these are people who've been just taking drugs, and they don't want to do it anymore. And, it's the addictive cycle that's reinforcing it, and that that they have literally failed all other treatments, and they're getting onto a clinical trial and being able to use psilocybin in a clinical setting has had phenomenal effects in terms of their ability to stop using. And I think that that's just really, really profound. And I think that it's shown as well in the the research studies that are being demonstrated as well, that people are looking at days of abstinence or days of reduced drinking behavior, and just seeing these huge shifts in people who are on the DSM,
Mm,
diagnosably,
yeah.
these effects, alcohol abuse disorder, and they're just seeing such huge shifts. And I think that's really, really profound and really important that these are happening.
Yeah.
I love talking to clinicians about what they're doing with their with their studies as well. I'm like, I just want to know, like, tell me.
Yeah.
I want to hear about, not so much. I don't really like hearing about people's trips. I'm like, it's kind of like listening to people's dreams. I'm like, they're all sort of like, I'm like, that's really nice that happened, and it's obviously very meaningful for you. I don't understand the core importance of it, but yeah, I think that the aspect is more the integration afterwards, what that meant, what that means to people, how that's then integrated into their life, and the behavior change that can be evoked from that experience. I think that's the core aspect, where you unpack it and then start to repackage it back together again, and see people really putting their life back on the line.
I love it. Thanks for sharing that. I have this fantasy that, like, you know, in my mind, I think it's fair to say that societies run on drugs, like whether it's alcohol or caffeine. Like we sanction drugs, and like our culture runs on it. We've been running on like caffeine and alcohol for a long time, and it's such a strange relationship. Like we even in the states where you say, "Oh, we have drugs and alcohol." Like, why do you? Isn't alcohol a drug too? Like, why are we separating that? And there's all these problems around alcohol abuse, and we see the effects of what that particular drug does to an individual, to a family, to when people are driven to excess about it. And I'm just in my mind, in my dream, in my fantasy, I'm like, what if we just switched alcohol for psilocybin? What if we switched these drugs that tend to make us forget about the pain and then feel bad after, to drugs that make us feel bad now and then we feel good after. You know what I mean? Like, like maybe we can, like, and why not? Like, I see it happening at the forefront, talking to you, the clinicians, a lot of the veterans, a lot of the people that I speak to is like, yeah, there is kind of this shift happening. Is that too um Pollyanna to think that we could switch up and like just run on a different set of drugs? And if why not psilocybin?
I mean, I think that it's it's like when you. I remember reading about where they had a wedding, and the people at the wedding were just like, "We're not going to do alcohol at a wedding, because nobody needs alcohol at weddings.
Right?
Like, that's where the fights start." And there's always the sloppy drunks and the crying and then the fights, and it's nobody has a good time really. But yeah, maybe just microdose your way through the wedding, and just make everything like nice and sparkly, and make everyone just really warm,
Yeah.
fuzzy, and having like a just taking the edge off all the social requirements of these sort of large events. I mean, I do think as well that there's alcohol is it's so accepted by society, but when you think about the number of deaths that it
Yeah.
causes, and not just through like alcohol abuse, but people driving cars intoxicated, people getting into accidents intoxicated, and it's just sort of being acknowledged as part of society that it's just alcohol, and going to wine receptions at conferences, people who don't drink. And I think that as well, with looking at the shifts of how it's moving now, that more and more people are embracing sobriety, because they've realized that the mental health implications and the health implications of overconsumption of alcohol, it's just detrimental to your mental health. It's detrimental to your health in general. Like, we don't need people having alcoholic fatty liver disease. We don't need individuals, it's avoidable. And I think about horrific anxiety that people experience. I have, like, you go to an event and you just have that, like, one too many, and you're like, oh God, did I really say that? and I just think that you maybe make it so it's less expected in social situations, and start to embrace other aspects. I'm not sure whether you go to a sort of wine reception mixer and everyone's just given a sort of mushroom at the start and being told we'll kick in about 30 minutes. It's like lemon tech, be like, yeah, put some ginger in so it might, like,
Right.
gut rot. But, I think that people might have a much nicer time, and there's probably a much more meaningful connections made, as opposed to the the social lubricant that is alcohol, or how it is portrayed to be.
It's so true. It's such a great point. I'm hopeful for it, and I see it happening on some level, and I try to foster in the new world by creating it. So that's kind of what I do as well. It's like, I'm going to do this instead. It kind of brings up this idea of nootropics too. Like, there seems to be this new class. Well, it's probably been around for a while, but if you look at some of the racetam family, or some of these particular, like, phenobut that works on the GABA receptors, and there seems to be sort of this class of drugs or novel compounds or peptides even, that are allowing people to maybe elevate their awareness, but also their cognition on some level. What are your thoughts on these new nootropics coming out? And might that be the biological answer to the problems we have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the moment, the nootropics, they're, it's a really fascinating area. I just think that the problem is that it's going through more of the nutraceutical pathway,
Mm-hmm.
or the supplement pathway, so it's very unregulated. So
Right.
people can be purchasing these and they don't really know what's in them, which is definitely an issue. I mean, when I think about proper nootropics, I'm like, like the sort of stuff that fighter pilots take, that just keeps them very stimulated and aware.
Mm.
We think about caffeine. I mean,
Yeah.
caffeine is a cognitive
Right.
enhancer. I mean, it's really, really effective. I mean, we don't all need to be taking modafinil, but you want that laser focus for that piece
Yeah.
of work that really needs to be in. But just take some modafinil. And there's also the misuse as well of stimulants, I think.
Right.
Well, Adderall, and how people
Yep.
are utilizing these drugs that are there for people really with ADHD, to help them recalibrate their brain so that they can increase their focus. But there's then the gray market associated with these, like, drugs, that people take them because they are performance enhancers in a way. And I think that there's going to be room for these nootropics. I think, again, that they're going to have to be properly clinically studied if you're going to use them for an actual condition. Say somebody's got Alzheimer's disease, like, what can be administered in that situation that will help stimulate memory formation and access. Looking at the cholinergic system, helping people pay more attention to the environment around them, so that then they're able to encode those memories that bit more efficiently. But yeah, there's obviously a lot that's available, and from my work as well, it's like people are like, oh, well, what can I take to make my brain function better? And I'm like, well, you know what, it's going to sound really boring. Omega-3s, your brain cells really need those. They're really good for keeping your neurons, like, well oiled, and able to form new connections. You really want those. and it's kind of a bit boring, but taking your B vitamins, getting some choline in there. I mean, it's the precursor to acetylcholine, so it's like eat your egg yolks. Um, but these are things that can all be adjusted through diet. And also I think that one of the key aspects for me is getting people off those the ultra processed foods. I mean, they're effectively refined to the degree of drugs, and there's lawsuits coming out at the moment that people are accusing, we used to say big pharma, these like big food, literally designing these foods, which we can kind of put in inverted commas. They've been designed in the same way as like nicotine almost, that they're addictive. You don't feel satiety on them, you just want more regardless. And that's just like that just really scares me. And I'm like, all about getting off that aspect of these diet and lifestyle and trying to embrace this more sort of holistic, eating real foods that are a food, not a pre-packaged situation that you just can microwave or just eat out of a packet that has no expiration date on it. And getting off those, often people see their cognition improve because it's causing them to their brain's less inflamed, their neuroplasticity increases because they're eating better, and they're getting more nutrients and anti-inflammatories, antioxidants, rather than taking these all as like supplements and pills. It's like getting rid of the thing that's causing this damage, to then allow the body and brain to reset and start to function adequately and then proficiently again.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It really helps understand that we're all parts in this giant system. Like when you take a holistic approach to it, like diet and exercise, and maybe some of these supplements that you can use that are going to help out also. Like there's no magic bullet in one of them, and if you just focus on one of them, you might get a little bit better. But you got to work on that whole system, right, in order to really function and have a better relationship with yourself and others out there. It's fascinating to me to see that. What are you like? You have done an incredible amount of work, and you have an incredible appetite, and you're very curious about all this work that's happening out there. What's on your radar right now? Like one of the things that you're most excited about when it comes to, I don't know, biopharma, drug development, psychedelics, or clinicians, or what are you super psyched about right now?
I've been finding real great interest in the non-hallucinogenic neuroplastogens that are designed off of the scaffolds, usually tryptamine scaffolds that are similar to psilocybin or psilocin, and how they've been chemically edited technically to alter how they're binding to receptors in the brain, and understanding the different pathways of how they are like activating these neurons, and activating receptors downstream to really get rid of so much of the psychedelic aspects. So the consciousness changing aspects are reduced, but the neuroplasticity aspect is still there. And I don't think that these are psychedelics. I don't want to say they're like psychedelics minus the psychedelic. I want to say that they're a new form of, they're like a new class of drugs, and that they are separate from the psychedelics, because I do think that the psychedelics are going to have an important place in therapy for individuals. It's like horses for courses. But I think that there's the potential of these novel compounds, we call them like new chemical entities, to be able to unlock like aspects of neuroplasticity without the changes to consciousness to potentially then have beneficial effects for neurological conditions or for neurodegenerative conditions. And when you think about as well that there are so many people that are currently in the exclusion criteria for psychedelics, there's individuals who can't potentially use them because when you think about someone, say, with Alzheimer's disease, there is the risk of psychosis. Same with Parkinson's disease. These are neurodegenerative conditions, but one of the aspects is that with a brain that is struggling on multiple points and multiple counts, that that consciousness changes caused by psychedelics could have risky downstream effects. What if you can administer somebody these neuroplastogens in a controlled way and help them to rebuild those synapses that are being lost, helping them to form rewire around the neurons that are being damaged by disease states. I think that's really important. And for people as well that have I think it could be sort of a almost maybe like a sort of adjusted entry into psychedelics as well for people. Potentially you've got somebody who said, like, we've got these short acting psychedelics. Some people who have mental health conditions but don't want to necessarily experience a 6-hour psilocybin trip or a 12-hour LSD trip. Like there's a large amount of expense associated with that, just from having the therapists and medical staff on hand to be able to do that in a clinical setting. But if you've got something that's not altering your consciousness, potentially that you could just take it and or go in for, say, a 1 to 2 hour like almost like a ketamine treatment, but with a much more potent psychedelic that is able to do its consciousness altering aspect in 1 to 2 hours, and then have your therapy session, say, the next day or straight afterwards. Almost that it's becoming more and more efficient. And although it sounds like capitalism, I'm like, get as many in as possible, because about this profit margin. But it's also the accessibility, that how I think the insurance companies will look at it. So they'll be well, we can't afford for you to take this route because it is such a a burden financially, but you could go in for a shorter acting treatment. And I think that that's the way that it's going to be scalable to allow more people to be able to get the benefits of these new treatments. And I'm just really hopeful as well that the clinical trials are going to be run well, with good measures. FDA is going to actually realize the their old paradigm of how they've been looking at clinical trials. Psychedelics don't really fit into the same way, but also that rigor that's associated with the clinical trials will show that there is going to be the benefits of these drugs, and that they're going to be able to be accessed by more people, so that more people will be able to experience the benefits.
Yeah, it's very promising. And there's a lot of applications it can be used for. If you look at maybe people that are in a coma, or people that may have experienced a stroke on some level. But how do you measure neuroplasticity, though? Like if on some level, I think we touched on it earlier, like perhaps it is the difficult times and changing of consciousness that is neuroplasticity. Like, how do you measure neuroplasticity in a clinical trial? Is it like a EKG machine, or like how do you even go about measuring that?
Yeah, so many clinical trials at the moment are using sort of scalable measurements of brain activity. So you can use like EEG, Anyone who's
Okay.
ever run an EEG experiment will tell you that it is a complete faff. Like, you've got all these electrodes, you've got to stick them on the head. There's loads of them. You've got, like, sort of electrode goo everywhere. You can use the dry electrodes. They hurt. They're not very comfortable. So at the moment, a lot of EEG is being used at that sort of phase 1 stage, where it's the early clinical trial, and you can say, like, okay, so there's a change here. There's also the importance that there's no neuroimaging biomarker of, say, depression. So you can't run somebody through an MRI, an fMRI, and say, read out, do the analysis and say, yeah, their brain is depressed, because it doesn't exist. And that is again, it's a complexity that we deal with, that you've got to have a validated biomarker of improvement. So at the moment, clinical trials, we're not measuring neuroplasticity. What you're measuring is, clinician reported outcomes. You're looking at the MADRS or the HAM-D scores or the Hamilton like anxiety measures. You're looking at effectively a number on a graph, and you're looking at before, after, and a couple of other measurements. And that's what's being acknowledged, because it's almost like the added complexity of trying to also include all these additional measures that are a patient burden. I mean, I don't know if you've been in a MRI. They're claustrophobic. It's like being in a giant tunnel, and it's noisy, and you're like, lie back and just sort of think of England, and just acknowledge that it's just like making a lot of noise. And if you're doing a task in there as well, it's it's distracting. You can't move your head because you just have to like stay very still. And I think that it's a patient burden that is additional. And not only onto that, it's like a lot of people aren't actually compliant to be able to be neuroimaged. If you've got any amount, it's a big old magnet. You've got any metal in you're not going in there. Like, there's some horrific pictures on the internet of like, this is what happens when that somebody brings a metal chair into the scanner room and it's like glued to the scanner. And so you can imagine, if somebody's got like any metal in them, you've got to like demonstrate that it's like non-magnetic and compliant. And so again, it's that additional patient burden. I think there's a lot of call for the understanding of neuroplasticity induced by psychedelics in the academic setting. I'm like, let the academics loose with this. Like, they have, these tools available to them in terms of neuroimaging. Like, they often get, the absolute top, newest scanners, newest technologies that can be applied in the best possible way, and they can do these, beautiful academic studies that they could then publish in Nature, and that's where the understanding lies. But in the place of a clinical trial, I think that it's getting these outcomes that are cost efficient, accessible, reduced patient burden or subject burden, and are the most informative for what you're doing at what you're trying to do. So I'm like, don't overcomplicate things. Save the money. Just get more participants, more subjects, and then do a really nice, clean clinical trial. Don't go messing it up with some novel brain imaging.
It's fascinating to me to get to hear that insight right there. I appreciate it. Amy, I am having a phenomenal time talking to you. I feel like we just started our conversation and it's already been I know. Like I already have like 15 more questions. You have to come back because I've barely got through a few of them, and I really enjoy talking to you, and I really enjoy your insight, and I think you bring a novel perspective and a fresh perspective to this whole space, right? And I'm truly thankful for it. But as we begin to land this plane right here, I was very hopeful that you could tell people where they can find you, what you have coming up, and what you're excited about. If they heard our conversation, they want to reach out to you, and they're like, well, I want her on my podcast. I want to interview her for a book. I want her to speak at my event. How can they find you?
So my website's amyreichelt.com. So there's all contactability and things on there. Ways of getting hold of me is pretty easy if you go to my website. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of consulting in psychedelic space and drug development space. I love it. I love like working with different companies. It's like super interesting being able to think about all the competitive intelligence of what's going on, and I feel like there are these like people behind the scenes like me, and we're like, yeah, we know what's going on. I'm hoping that 2025 as well is going to be some really great conferences as well. We've got the Psych Science in Denver 2025, and I hope to be able to get to maybe the Breaking Convention as well in Exeter, and if anybody wants me to speak, please.
Right.
And hopefully there's going to be some really interesting clinical trial data coming out as well. So I think that there's more and more insights coming through, and there'll be some phase 2s wrapping up next year, and some nice data for me to rip to shreds. So it's been a trying 2024, and I'm just hopeful that 2025 is going to be a change for the better. I say that every year. But yeah, it's been I'm hopeful that the space is going to start to liven up again, because I felt like we were in definitely the trough of disillusionment for a while, and that we're crawling our way out of that space.
Yeah, I agree. I am really looking forward to 2025 and it being a year of big discoveries and excitement and things getting much better. I think that they will be, and I think you're going to be a big part of it, Amy. I really enjoyed listening to you on the psychedelic science. I enjoy checking out the research you're doing, and you're a phenomenal consultant and an awesome person to talk to. And I can't wait for the next conversation we're going to have. But for everybody within the sound of my voice, if you enjoyed this conversation, reach out to Dr. Amy, go down to her website, check out all the things she's doing there. If you need a speaker, Ben Grinswig, I know you're Psych 2025. This is the girl you should be having speak there. Maps, you guys already know. Come on, get her over there. What are you guys doing? That's all we got, ladies and gentlemen. Amy, hang on briefly afterwards. To everybody else within the sound of my voice, I hope you have a beautiful day and you find the courage to become the very best person that you can be. That's all we got, ladies and gentlemen. Aloha.
Thank you.